Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, welcome to The Reason We Learn. I am your host, Deb Philman, and today we're going to talk about social emotional learning, or more accurately, social emotional and academic development through an equity lens. We're going to talk about what that means, and we're going to specifically look at a report from a group called the Education Trust. And it's a report that came out in August of 2020. So it's been around for a while. But I want to walk you through it because there's some language you should see, especially since it's over a year old, because this is what's finding its way into our classrooms. Before I begin with this process, though, I would like to ask those of you who are here already to please consider liking this video and sharing it out so more people can come and see it live and join us in the chat to ask questions. And also, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you would like to support my work or just be notified when I make new videos, please consider subscribing. What you may not already know is that I maintain a locals community at thereasonwelearn.locals.com, where I talk in more depth about these things. And we have a weekly Zoom call you can join if you're a supporter. And I also am a private tutor. So if you're looking for tutors, especially writing, ELA, history, send me a message. I work with kids, usually fourth grade and up, all the way through high school. And I have a specialty right now of helping kids write their college essays. So if you or anyone you know needs that, please have them send me a message. So let's talk about social emotional learning. For those of you new to the channel or new to this term, you probably heard it more recently than you've ever heard it before, if you've heard it at all. And it usually refers to the precondition for learning anything, like that you need to be ready emotionally and socially to be able to access the learning in a learning environment, especially a school. And so the focus of social emotional learning used to be on helping kids manage their emotions, deal with conflict resolution, work well with others, all those kinds of things you need to do when you're in an environment with other people trying to learn. It's very difficult if you're kind of tied up in anxious knots and you're trying to access new information, be difficult to do. It's also difficult if you're feeling bullied or persecuted or any of those things. So on the surface, SEL, as it's called, is a good thing for teachers to be aware of the fact that their students don't just walk into the classroom blank slates. They're little humans. They have social and emotional needs. They have social and emotional strengths and social and emotional weaknesses that can help or hinder their learning. So this is a good thing, right? For teachers to be aware of this. It's, above and beyond your subject matter. And for a long time, it seemed like that's what it was about, helping kids just, hey, here's how we can talk about these things and resolve conflicts. And here's how you can calm yourself down if you're stressed. Here's how to come and talk to your teacher, talk to other kids. Here are what social skills are, things like that. The problem is, in recent years, SEL has taken on a new role. The process of doing SEL in school has shifted from being about the individual and optimizing the individual's opportunity to learn and grow in school and as a person to helping that individual right societal wrongs. So it's become part of the push for equity overall. The kids are being used to advance the equity agenda, and they're going through SEL to do it. I've heard other people describe it as an operating system. So in other words, when we use SEL, we're sort of reprogramming the child to see him or herself not as an individual any longer, but as a piece of a larger whole, and not just how you would ordinarily do it. Like, I'm a person and I live in a community, but you're a member of a community first, or you're members of these groups first. And their primary role is to understand your role in that group and your role in the society. You as an individual are not really primary in that equation. So that's how it's morphing. And many of us are concerned because we see what used to be, a good thing or potentially a good thing in the right hands turned into a weapon, quite literally, a weapon to divide children first from themselves So, from their own sense of self as an individual, as a growing and developing person in their own right, and then to separate them from their families, their parents, traditions that they might have outside of the school, that this is about centering them in the community, specifically the school community, and then, of course, the larger societal community defined by the school, not defined by you and not defined by your individual child. So many of us are concerned that the kids are going to be literally harmed. They actually are. I would say that some of this is abusive because it puts adult expectations and adult responsibilities onto children as far as their roles in society, the role in the school, and then the role in society. And it's doing so, as you will see when we go over this report, using immutable characteristics. So rather than having, just the teachers be informed that this is a child coming to you from, a single parent household. And so when that happens, these are some things to look for. And these are some ways you can help kids who might be going through some of these things. If you see these challenges, it's become a kids who are this race or kids who are this gender have these problems or serve this role or have these challenges as a group. They may or may not, as we all know, right? Just because you're Black doesn't mean you even come from a single parent household. Just because you come from a single parent household doesn't mean you're traumatized. Just because you get where I'm going, right? So lots of generalities, lots of assumptions, and lots of claims that there's evidence, but I'm not really seeing it. So without further ado, let's start going through what I have for you, this material. Now, as I said, this report, I'm going to bring it up on first, I'm going to bring up the summary of the report, and I'm not going to read every single bit, but we will read parts of it. And then I'm going to bring up the PDF of the report itself. And I will put these links in the show notes below when we're done. If you want to follow along, I will give you these links right now in the comments. Okay. So this is the summary link I'm pasting in there. That's what we'll go through first. And then second, there, and you could download this PDF from here, but here's the PDF we'll go through second. Okay. So if you want to just kind of follow along and be able to see it more clearly yourself as I'm talking, because you don't need to look at my face, you just might want to look at the report, that's fine. And then if you do that, what you could do is you could throw a question up in the chat, and I'll do my best to try to accommodate you, but it's hard to look in multiple places at the same time. So let me get this up on the screen and we will begin to talk about it. Okay. So here is the summary. As you can see, it says social, emotional, and academic development through an equity lens. It's too tiny, so I'll read some of it. The majority of public schools and districts in the US report they are working to support the social and emotional learning of students. But in too many places, the approach is to focus narrowly on changing student behavior rather than implementing practices that build relationships and create learning environments that support positive social and emotional growth. This is especially true in schools and districts that serve large populations of students of color and students from low income backgrounds, exposing these students to environments that could do more harm than good. What I want to point out to you and try to translate for you is how many premises are in this paragraph that you may just kind of gloss over. Lots of stereotyping going on here that we sort of take for granted and move on because of the way they're embedded in the text. In too many places, the approach is to focus narrowly. Says who? I would like to see evidence for that. What define narrowly? And then they say on changing student behavior. Well, maybe it's changing student behavior. Maybe it's just supporting student behavior, supporting student learning. They're making an assumption that the people doing SEL are trying to fix the students. I don't and haven't seen a lot of evidence for that. Then it says, rather than implementing practices that build relationships and create learning environments that support positive social and emotional growth. Again, says who? Where are they getting that information? These are value judgments. They are judging schools, too many places, and basically between the lines in a very scholarly way, accusing teachers, accusing support staff of possibly harming students by not working on building relationships. Now, again, this may or may not be happening, and it may or may not be happening on a school by school basis or even on a staff member by staff member basis. But baked in here is a big premise that this is the status quo, is we're doing it wrong. Okay. So I just want to lay that out, that this isn't starting from the premise of, hey, we're doing great things, but we could do better, or we're doing good things, but here's an improvement. This is no, no, we're doing it wrong. Okay. And in fact, they go so far as to say exposing these students to environments that could do more harm than good. I like a lot of more definition on that myself, but I'm a close reader, so that's what I do. In social, emotional, and academic development through an equity lens, we lay out how to shift the focus away from fixing kids. There's that premise again, that the focus is fixing kids. I've never heard that. I've never seen that. I've never seen people that I know who specialize in counseling or SEL talk about fixing kids. They're not presumed to be broken. They are presumed to be new and possibly struggling or ignorant or just lacking in skills or developing or growing, or pick another word, but not broken. And towards addressing adult beliefs and mindsets, as well as school and district policies to create an equitable learning environment. So there's that subtle accusation that the adults in the environment are the problem. This is about re-education of teachers and support staff because they're presumed to be doing it wrong. Now, if you take a big step back from this, you might think, well, Deb, okay, but what's wrong with taking the focus off the kids and putting the focus on the adults in the room and saying, hey, what could you do better to better support these kids? Well, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. It's the presumption that you need that first of all, that this is the focus, that we need to shift away from it, that it wasn't always on professional development, because guess what, it was. But there's that. And then the second thing is that the teachers have the wrong mindset. Whenever you see the word mindset in education literature, that should be a little red warning flag that somebody's trying to change worldview. Somebody's trying to change core philosophy of learning, core philosophy of the purpose of education. A mindset is the code for wrong think. Okay. Our approach is supported by existing research, as well as what our researchers learned from focus groups. Now we're talking about anecdotal evidence. I don't you think this should be linked in here, or something? There should be specific pullouts from the research. I do personally, or citations. Um, Focus groups around the country with students and families of color, primarily those from Black and Latino communities. Participants discuss the importance of social emotional skills, what students of color need to learn other than academic subjects, and what educators and school leaders can do to support social, emotional, and academic development for students of color. So we're already getting into a kind of racial essentialism that groups students of color as if they're one kind of student. And that, I believe, is a false premise. Again, because if you look at the data, it will show you that income, socioeconomic level, for example, factors like single parent households, factors like, whether the parents are educated, these have much more of a role in the student's outcome than just their status as a person of color. As the research in this area continues to grow and as state district and school leaders consider policy changes to support social, emotional, and academic development, the voices of these families and students must be heard and valued. Presumption that they weren't. No one said they shouldn't. The question is, what's the hierarchy? How much do we value anecdotal evidence, and how big were these focus groups? And do we make giant shifts in policy or make presumptions about people they aren't, who are not in their community, based on things they said? Would you do it the other way around? Would you focus group, for example, white and Asian families to find out what to do with social emotional learning, and then go and start saying what the Black and Latino kids need to learn based solely on that focus group or those focus groups? No, you would not. That would be transparently racist, right? But that is exactly what they've done. Without equity-focused policies, and notice they never define equity for us. We're left to figure out what that means. Now, lately, what that means is equal outcome. Are equal academic or social and emotional outcomes possible in reality? Are equal outcomes possible? No, they're not. Now, if you, again, benefit of the doubt, if you step back and say, okay, maybe they mean equitable, giving the kids equal access to the learning from the get-go. Okay, I'll travel there with you. How might we do that? Now you've seen the graphic with the little kids, stepping on the boxes to watch the game. And what's interesting is it never occurs to them to, buy a ticket, but that's a whole other conversation. Um, the the presumption is we need to, you know, lift up. They say we got to lift up those who are shorter, right? So they can see the game. But in practice, that's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to, if the students are analogous to like blades of grass in your lawn, okay? And you want your lawn to be equally beautifully green and all the same length. Is it easier to do when you're working with limited resources and or you don't have control over all the variables, because in this situation you surely do not? Is it easier to try to, fertilize the grass and get equal perfectly green healthy lawn, or mow the lawn? Which one's easier to get equal length of grass? Okay? So that's what ends up happening in practice is you tend to focus on the greatest need, the lowest common denominator in terms of achievement, in terms of need, behavior issues and things like that. And anybody else is presumed okay, fine. We don't need to pay attention to that. It's very difficult to give supports to everybody where they need it. And so what happens is it's determined that the students who don't fit into these categories, these at-risk categories, or now they've specified black and brown, right? To say, well, they don't need the supports. And as you'll see when we get into the report, they take it a step farther to say not only do they not need the supports, they need differentiated instruction in SEL because they have extra responsibility to fix society so that we can give fewer supports. So we'll need to give fewer supports because they're white. So it's not just they don't need our supports, but they need to actually be instructed in their obligation to fix things. I'll show you if you think I'm making it up. I'm not. It's a direct quote. All right. So again, with mindset, without equity focused policies, the right mindset and appropriate responses, educator biases, the presumption of bias, whether implicit or explicit, we already know that implicit bias is junk science. So they're again using it like it's fact. They're presuming it to be present, will continue to unfairly, big presumption here, will continue to unfairly and unjustly marginalize some students. That's a big leap, isn't it? We know this. Everybody reading this should be saying, how do you know? How do you know that these biases are present in all these teachers? And secondarily, how do you know they are marginalizing students? And how do you know they're marginalizing these students? So you've got several layers of presumption there, but they write it in such a beautiful academic sounding way that you're like, oh, yes, this is bad. We need to fix this. And that's where I come in to translate it for you and say, hold the phone. Is this even true? How do you know? Compared to what? Right? Which undermines their excellence and results in real and harmful consequences when in fact the context in which students learn are what should be addressed. The context. First, I think you need to clearly define what the existing context is, not all of these assumptions. Social, emotional, and academic development should be administered with a student's first approach. I thought the first goal was to change the mindset of the adults in the room. Now I'm confused. So it's a student's first approach, but we have to change the mindset of the adults. Which students? All the students or just the marginalized students? How are we measuring any of this? You see where I'm going. Okay. Now Siri is talking to me and thinking I'm speaking to her. To that end, rather than simply adding on more policies to existing ones, schools and districts should revisit entirely what's already in place first and ask whether they equitably foster. Here's another word for you to note. Okay, so first you had mindset. Jot that down. Now you have belonging. Belonging. Why are we suddenly talking all about belonging? Is school a club? Is school a place? Now, I mean, it's a natural human desire to sort of belong to something, but does it hinder your learning if you just sort of go to school and you're there to do your learning? Like, is that automatically to your detriment if you don't feel like some special sense of belonging? Do we know that? Maybe it isn't. Maybe, maybe it isn't. I mean, it might be. We don't know. What we do know is we know that an awful lot of people have gotten very well educated in the past without specifically feeling like they belonged. And it wasn't necessarily race specific. Raise your hand if you were ever bullied and felt like you were on the outs with your peers. Raise your hand if you ever sat in a class and didn't feel like you really belonged. Raise your hand if you learned anyway. Raise your hand if you would have felt kind of weird and strange if the teacher started focusing a whole lot on you and your lack of belonging. I mean, it's a presumption that, belonging is what the adults say it is and that it directly hinders your learning. I would like to see some hard evidence that that's even true. I'm not arguing kids should be bullied or left out. Don't hear me saying that. I'm saying that this assumption that we have to do all of this belonging is really just another code for saying we need to get these kids into their appropriate tribe. We need to give them identity markers and tell them who they are for our other agenda, for the rest of our agenda. But that we want you, the adults reading this, to believe that belonging is central to learning. I would argue the opposite, that belonging is the beginning of the hindrance to learning. Because if you put tribe above your own individual goals, not good things happen. All right. I mean, there's healthy belonging and then there's adult defined belonging. And that's what this is. Okay. Social, emotional, and academic development through an equity lens provides a framework and action items for school and district leaders to undertake this work. Okay. Well, they have these different sections. So they have the first section is re-envisioning social, emotional, and academic development, right? This is where we got to re-envision. It's sort of like decentering, deconstruct, re-envision, all of these words, because apparently it's bad now. It says studies also show that social emotional well-being as well as academic performance are both inextricably linked to the overall context in which students develop and the relationships they build over time. Contextual factors such as societal realities, racism, sexism, homophobia, individual realities, socioeconomic status, family dynamics, experiences in schools. Is this starting to sound kind of therapeutic? Because it is. That's the point. What they're saying now is schools need to be more things to these students. Schools need to take into account all kinds of variables they have no control over and need to attempt to see the students learning through these lenses they can't possibly know are accurate. That you can't. You got 30 kids in the class. You don't know what you're making lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of assumptions and adding layers of bias. You're not taking them away. You're literally adding more layers of bias. Oh, you are, female and you're Black and you live in this neighborhood and it's so forth and so on. That means X. This is the context. This is the lens through which I must see you and adjust your education. How do you even know that? They're actually training the teachers to be more biased and stereotype more. Because learning. Social, emotional, and academic development in context, why it matters. Now they're going to explain why. The argument for considering context is necessary in all education issues, but it is especially critical for this topic because the environment in which students are learning, as well as where adults are teaching and leading, cannot be disassociated from social, emotional, and academic development. And the sun rises in the east. Okay, that explains why you might examine context. It doesn't really argue for making it an imperative to make lots of assumptions about that context. So, I wouldn't advocate walking into a school and just being completely oblivious to the neighborhood and the socioeconomic status of your students or even their racial experience or cultural experience or language barriers. But I would caution people against making giant assumptions about that. That's that creepy, like, oh, you're this, that means this kind of thing. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think you should meet individuals where they are because they might surprise you. They're also going to respect you and trust you a lot more than if you come at them with, today we're going to learn math using hip hop because surely you must love hip hop because you're Black. Wouldn't you think that would be more insulting? So this is, context is fine, but I don't think we start designing a lot of things around presumed context. All of students' experiences, including home life, bouts with racism and cultural background, influence social, emotional, and academic development. Yes. And that's where parents come in. Not going to disagree that these things do influence their social, emotional, academic development, but the school needs to know where to stay in its lane. Okay. What they're doing now is they're stating the obvious, and then they're letting you believe that by stating the obvious, observing the obvious, that they're the ones to fix it. They're the ones to address it. Instead of just being aware of it and respectful of it and saying, it's something I need to pay attention to and be on the lookout for in case my student's having a problem or having an issue that's in my toolkit of things to think about. Now it's, we need to fix this. The school needs to fix this. Maybe you agree. I don't come from the place that says that all of this learning needs to be taken care of in the school. In fact, I think more harm is done when you try to do that. You can't possibly know what's going on in that kid's life. And if you start prying and prying and digging, and this is where SEL surveys come in, I think, especially if you are not a trained psychologist or clinician. And first of all, how much time do you have left for academic instruction? How much time do the students have to work things out on their own and figure out the world on their own and make their own friendships and solve their own problems? And when do you get, as an adult and a professional, get to do your own professional development, right? You're so busy like diving deep into the psychology of your students. It's just a bit much. I don't think it's a good idea. I think they need to stay in their lane. These same societal realities influence adult beliefs, expectations, and actions, all of which affect adult interactions with students and, in turn, students' social, emotional development and well-being and academic performance. Again, we state the obvious, but we imply that the school is there to fix it for the adults who work in the school. That's starting to feel like I'm going to have someone looking over my shoulder, if I'm a teacher, judging everything I say and do in the class by whether I am towing the appropriate mindset line. Again, here, right think or wrong think, to address the kids' social, emotional needs. They are putting a huge responsibility and burden on individual teachers. And I would hear this as I'm about to be scrutinized to within an inch of my life. I am about to be studied and judged and have everything that I do be put under like, a magnifying glass to see if I'm doing it right, even though I can no more influence the biases or whatever that I have, that I bring from my daily life, and teach and be a good person and all these things than the man in the moon. I mean, it's just too much to be constantly mindful of. So what this does is this kind of hyper contextualizing everything, complete with its false assumptions and its false premises, creates a low level of anxiety in the environment at all times. Instead of just being and realizing that human beings are flawed. We make mistakes. We make, oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for telling me I didn't know that, or whatever, however we used to do it. Right. And unless you were doing something egregious, like really outside the bounds of, proper behavior, or, being stereotypical and racist and, overtly awful. Oops, I goofed, right? Like I can learn, and now you have a conversation with your supervisor or, whatever, but presumably we're hired because you fit into the culture in the first place, right? You would hope. So this just creates this like low level generalized anxiety of like, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Am I making it's like the inverse of looking for microaggressions. It's looking at yourself to avoid doing them if you're the teacher. So we've got the kids running around going, are they offending me? Are they offending me? Am I offended? Am I being persecuted? That's what this kind of SEL does. And on the teacher side, it's, I can't be offensive. I can't be offensive. I can't do this. I got to look at this. I got to look at that. And then, like I said, more often than not, inadvertently stereotyping people who are little kids or even teenagers who are not very likely to say, lady, you're making a complete fool of yourself. Like, stop, just stop. What they're more likely to do is not trust you, not talk to you, lie to you outright, etc. If there's one thing I know about kids is they can smell phony a mile away. They can smell phony, and they do one of two things. They either avoid it and mistrust it, or they use it. So I just don't think this is healthy. I don't think this level of scrutiny is healthy. That's, again, my opinion. Your mileage may vary. Section 3, focus group findings, how students and families of color approach social, emotional, and academic development. And they have this, how do participants perceive the importance of it, etc. I mean, I suggest you go through this. I'm not going to go through every one, but I just want to take you through the sections. It might be interesting to see what they said because that's where they're going to base all this on. Shifting the focus, moving away from fixing kids, from a deficit-based mindset to a strength-based mindset. Again, who said it was a deficit? This is like people saying, oh, you're not conforming to gender norms. You have gender dysphoria, as opposed to, no, I'm a tomboy, right? It's not that you're broken. It's you're new here. You're inexperienced. So nobody said that kids had a deficit of social emotional learning or social emotional skills. They're just kids. They're immature. That's what happens. If they haven't learned it yet, they haven't learned it yet. I don't really call that a deficit. I just call that an area for growth or whatever you want to call it. But I don't, as a teacher, I never looked at my kids going, oh, you have a deficit of skill in this area. Would you look at a pre-verbal child and say you have a deficit in speaking ability? No, you wouldn't. So again, this presumption of a mindset that I don't think exists. And to a strength-based mindset, that's a matter of opinion. If it's a strength, what are the specific goals that we're working towards? And I don't think teachers look at it as a strength. It's just maturity. You either have these, skills and you're on your way to maturity, or you're working at a developmentally appropriate level when it comes to social and emotional skills, or you aren't, in which case you need some supports. But nobody's looking at it as fixing broken people. From one size fits all to recognizing cultural and contextual influences. I went to graduate school in 1989. We were talking about cultural and contextual influences then. This is acting like this is new is false. There's an entire generation of teachers who've already been taught that we shouldn't walk into the classroom and be Archie Bunker. Okay. And hopefully the reverse is true as well. All right. But so this idea that we're starting from zero and it's not one size fits all. It hasn't been one size fits all for a very long time. From allowing bias. Wait, I'm sorry. What? Allowing bias to impact students, to targeted and continuous efforts to reduce bias. That's where that scrutiny is coming in. Remember I told you? Targeted and continuous efforts to reduce bias. First of all, you can't get rid of all of it, nor should you. Nor should you. Some biases are heuristics and they're helpful. So we need some definition around these biases. But this is just way too much. It is way too much. Here's this is a great point. Schools aren't responsible for children's emotional development. They're just not. They're really not. They are responsible, I think, to the extent that they can, to safeguard a child's, sense of, peace of mind or physical safety or even emotional safety as much as they can. In other words, if you're a teacher in a classroom and kids are verbally abusing another child, absolutely it is your responsibility to stop that. But this is what we used to have, just general rules of conduct. And you enforce the rules of conduct, even the conduct of the way you speak to people and the way you treat people with respect, or you don't. But we're going so far off the deep end that now it's like, oh, it's culturally appropriate for people to cuss and scream and yell at each other. That's what happens in their culture. So we're going to, no, it's not. That may be a context in which someone is growing up that doesn't make it something we can recognize it, but it doesn't make it something we encourage or allow. Okay. So if I have a bias against verbal abuse of me or my other students, then that's a good bias, because you really aren't going to have an easy time teaching or learning in a room where people are cussing at each other and calling each other names, even if it's meant in good fun, even if it's like, how kids sometimes do, especially in middle school. No, I don't care if it's culturally relevant. It's not appropriate. Let's see. Foster student changing systems. What? So we went from student-centered and now we're changing systems and policies. Foster student belonging, challenge students to reach their potential. Weren't we always doing that? Isn't the whole point of school? Provide academic and holistic supports. Where to start? Action items for equitably approaching social, emotional, academic development. So I'm not going to go through any more of this, because what I want to do now is I want to show you the report itself, in particular one section, because it blew my mind. And it's what caused me to come on here today and do this. I felt like you people need to know what's going on. And I'm sure most people missed this back in August. So here is the Education Trust August 2020 full report from the PDF. All right, here it all is. Now, what I'm going to do, just so you see, is I'm going to do a search. I'm going to do a find on white students. Okay, see what happened? So now we are on, there's 5 matches throughout this report. And let's take a look at what some of them say. Because again, I'm not going to read this whole report to you, but let's just take a look at some of their biases while we're looking at bias, while we're talking about bias. Okay. So we go up here. Educators' biases, for instance, influence whether they see a student's behavior as acceptable or punishable, harmless or threatening. Implicit or explicit bias can lead educators to disproportionately punish Black students for behaviors that are just as common for white students. Really? I'd really like to see the data on that. I like to see the data on how that number, which I do believe is probably true that you see, a greater number. Otherwise, they'd just be making stuff up out of thin air. But they're attributing it to an implicit and explicit bias. And they're saying these behaviors are just as common. What they're saying is that teachers are not punishing white students for things they are punishing Black students for. Like they're both misbehaving, they're both doing the same behavior, but they're disciplining the Black students and not the white students. Educator bias is a significant barrier for Black and Latino students' access to advanced courses. Where's the evidence for that? Is that true? Or is that an assumption based on outcome? Now, remember, in critical theory, we go with outcomes as evidence. Outcome is evidence of cause all by itself. Circular reasoning. So they're saying that because there are few Black and Latino students in the advanced courses, that's a significant educator bias is the significant barrier getting in the way. How do you measure that? In order for educators to guard against microaggressions that harm social emotional well-being for students of color and to behave in ways that support conditions that eliminate stereotype threat. Really? Stereotype threat. Are we not stereotyping the teachers? Are we not stereotyping the white students? Well, I haven't gotten to that part yet. You'll see. But so we don't want to have stereotype threat for these students. But I'm wondering how consistent that is across the board. Educator bias must be addressed, right? We got to fix that mindset. We haven't proven to you yet that it exists. We're assuming it exists because of the lack of numbers of kids who fit these demographics in the advanced classes. Now let's go to the next match. Let's see. How do I get to the next one? Here we go. All right. This is the one I wanted to show you. I'm going to start up here at while. See this? While. Okay. While students can benefit from learning to self-manage, educators should be cautious not to stymie the need for students, and especially students whose communities are historically underserved and discriminated against, to also learn to protest and resist against injustice in productive and democratic ways. Furthermore, white students may require differentiated social emotional supports, such as in learning to be anti-racist, particularly since they have the responsibility to dismantle a racist system that discriminates against Black, Latino, and other students of color, and they will need to learn to respectfully work with diverse populations as the country continues to diversify. If that's not the literal textbook definition of child abuse, I don't know what is. It is commonly understood that adults burdening children with adult mistakes or problems, or, saying, these adult problems created by adults, and that's assuming that we agreed that this is a problem, that there is a racist system that needs to be dismantled. I mean, even let's give them their argument, as Charles Love would say. Let's give them their argument that there's a racist system that discriminates and needs to be dismantled. Even if there were, which I disagree. Okay. except possibly in the schools, because here it is. Burdening children with that, saying since they have the responsibility, and they have the responsibility because they're white. They have the white students may require. What is differentiated social emotional support? Does that sound a little neo-segregationist to you? How might that manifest in a classroom? What do you think that's going to look like if your child is in a classroom where the teacher has taken this on and said, I have to provide differentiated social emotional supports for you and you and you and you because you're white? How are you do you think kids aren't going to notice if they're being pulled to the side or treated differently and they're all white? And if a teacher's mindset is changed or starts off at the place where my white students have the responsibility to dismantle the racist system, the children have the responsibility to do this. And I need to be the one telling them. I'm the one who's going to be providing them the supports so they can, live up to their responsibilities. Forget the responsibilities to themselves, to learn, to grow, to be, successful in school and self-sufficient out there in the world. No, 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 no. First order of business, they have to dismantle the racist system. Okay? This is literally child abuse. There's just, to my way of thinking, no, I don't even know where to go with this other than to call it out to you and ask you, my audience, if you are parents, if you are educators, if you are voters, if you are taxpayers, anybody, to take this and remember it, share it around, alert other people, and say, this was in 2020. SEL is now the hottest thing ever. Okay, we're not even talking about CRT all that much anymore. It's SEL, SEL, SEL. Well, SEL, as I said at the outset, is kind of the operating system, the mindset shift for the adults in the building and, of course, the children in their care, that they have these responsibilities. Okay, I'm going to actually start from the beginning of this page because I think it's all relevant. Let's just go through it. Here we go. From one size fits all to recognizing cultural and contextual influences. While many educators know that social emotional learning is about more than simply skill building, almost all social emotional work includes a focus on teaching specific competencies to students. Did you know you were sending your students to school to learn specific competencies in social emotional work? Did you know that? Okay. All too often, however, educators separate these efforts from context and rely on an underlying assumption that these competencies should look the same for all students. Well, I'm curious, how should conflict resolution practices or competencies look different based on someone's race or socioeconomic status? Should my daughter solve problems differently because she's white? Are the competencies really different? I mean, again, they say these things and we just keep on reading like, okay. This is inaccurate, and social emotional learning must center issues of race and injustice. It must. Why must it? Shouldn't we be asking that question? Why must it? What's the underlying assumption that says it must? Well, I'll tell you. It's because as Ibram X. Kendi is constantly telling us, present day discrimination is the only way to deal with the past discrimination. It's perfectly acceptable and desirable. So the competencies are going to shift because guess what? Conflict resolution and disciplinary practices must necessarily change based on the context of the person's race. So if you're wondering why it is that people seem to be pretty lax on discipline these days and teachers are like afraid to do anything and teachers aren't supported in disciplining kids and so forth, maybe they're just shifting their mindset to teach within the context of the kids who belong to a culture that was discriminated against in the past, and therefore the way we deal with it now is we teach them different competencies and make the white students responsible for dismantling a racist system. What is appropriate management of emotions and behavior in one culture may be perceived as inappropriate by individuals from another culture. Do you guys agree with that? Do you agree with that? Do you think that the expectations should be different in a classroom in terms of management of emotions and behavior based on culture that the individual comes from, their culture of origin, or their gender, or their sex, or their, their any of that? Do you think we should have different expectations? Can you imagine the teacher carrying that out in practice in a classroom? I expect more from you because you're white. Sit down, be quiet, behave yourself. Well, I mean, in their culture, what does that look like? Or do we just because we're most teachers aren't going to want to do that or say that because they face the reality. And the reality is that kids really aren't that different, especially if they're going to the same school. They're zoned for the same school. Their culture probably isn't all that different regardless of what they look like. Okay? So the teacher's not stupid. They don't want to get their butt kicked. So they're probably just going to not discipline anybody. They're not going to they're going to just stand there and do not much of anything because they don't want to differentiate their supports and have the students call them out. It would be blatantly racist, wouldn't it? And so typically when this happens, they do nothing. Because if you had a mixed class and you were to discipline the kids and somebody said, you're a racist, you're disciplining me only because I'm Black or Latino. If that were the accusation, then the teacher's feeling like, oh no, I'm going to be under the scrutiny of having the wrong mindset. I have the wrong mindset. My bias is showing. So nobody gets disciplined. Nothing happens. And what happens to the kids that are treated differently? And I'm only hypothesizing here, and it's not coming out of nowhere. It's not coming out of a vacuum. Okay. I talk to teachers a lot who are actually in the class. I may not be in the classroom anymore, but I have a lot of teacher friends, and I get private messages constantly, almost daily. I get them. They don't want to show their faces and names. They're not ready to do that. There are a couple who are, but many who are not. And I get messages saying, here's what happened today in my class, or here's what happened today in the hallway. Here's what happened in my school. This is what's going on. How many more years to retirement? These are the kind of things that I'm getting. So part of why I'm reacting to this way is that I have some inside scoop of my own. I have my own anecdotes. And as long as we're taking anecdotal evidence as equally important as data, why can't I use mine? Okay. I mean, all's fair, right? So that's the anecdotal evidence I'm hearing. And I have seen and witnessed myself when I was teaching in, like, the most recent time was 3 years ago in a middle school in the city where I live. Taught 6th and 7th graders. And I saw this in action. And thankfully, I was a volunteer, so I was not held to some of the same standards as the teachers who were paid. And I can assure you, I disciplined according to my standards. And guess what? I had kids coming up to me saying, your class is my favorite class in this school. I even had one student say she liked the class because I disciplined students. I wasn't mean. If a student was making it impossible for anybody else to learn, I made them leave, get out. And I had a couple times they were sent back to me. Somebody walked them back and said, you can't send them out. And I said, well, we have a problem. And I refused to teach. I stopped teaching on the spot. I said, I'm going to stand here and not teach this class unless this person agrees to behave himself, it was a boy in this case, and sit down and be quiet and not interrupt other people and let other people learn, or sit in the hall. And either he goes or I go. Those are the options. And I was a volunteer, so I could say that. And I did. It's tragic that we have paid teachers who can't do the same. They should be able to do the same. Say, I'm not maintaining an unsafe classroom, and I'm not going to shout over people, and I'm not going to let my other 20 some odd students suffer because I have to accommodate this person. Not going to happen. Okay. Now, like I said, and call them names. Wasn't mean. Just did what I thought was necessary. All right. So, given the culturally diverse population of the United States, it is not safe to assume that all students' growth in specific social emotional competencies should appear the same, especially since norms in the United States are largely based in Eurocentric white cultures. So what? What does that have to do with anything? There are behaviors that contribute to learning and flourishing and a healthy environment in a building where we all have to get along and share the same resources and spend the same amount of time to learn the same amount of material. And there are behaviors that are not conducive to that. That's fact. That's just objective fact. Okay? There's not there's not a lot of wiggle room in there. So whether they happen to be based in and I don't even agree with that. Why am I even going down that road? I don't agree with that. Go talk to some recent African immigrants. They're neither white nor Eurocentric. They come to this country and on balance do better in terms of socioeconomic growth and so forth, even than their white counterparts. And they went to school. And I've talked to some people from those communities and they're just aghast. They're like, where's the discipline? What the heck is going on? Now, isn't that interesting? Not white, not European, and yet they tell me stories of being in their classrooms, okay, in places like, Nigeria and Kenya and places like that, and being told, sit down, be quiet, speak when you're spoken to, raise your hand, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, et cetera, and so forth. And that may seem overly formal to some of your ears, but it worked. So what does that have to do with anything? So what? If it works, what difference does it make where it came from? Okay. And based in how many hundreds of years ago are we talking now? Like I said, we've got recent immigrants who are following the same plan. So based in, we're going back hundreds of years. How it's thousands? Where are we going? To Greece? Where are we going? How far back are we going to the behaviors that are conducive to learning in a classroom? Educators must recognize these influences both on their students and on themselves, including the impact of privilege or lack thereof. Why must we? First of all, what if I don't agree that any of that is true? And so why must I recognize something I already don't agree is a premise? And to what end? To what end? How am I helping my student? My bottom line as a teacher is, how does this help my student learn and be comfortable in this classroom? And I don't mean comfortable like cozy, like no discomfort whatsoever, because learning is discomfort to a certain degree. I'm talking about comfortable as in they don't feel literally persecuted. They aren't feeling like ganged up on, bullied, or abused. Okay? Which I used to think we could define. We could quantify what that looked like. But I never thought I would see the day when simply telling a student, you need to sit in your seat. You need to raise your hand when you want to speak. You need to not yell, scream, cuss, talk over people, throw things, get up and walk around whenever you want, disrespect the teacher with foul language, etc., whatever they get. No, I don't care a whit how much anybody can justify that those things come from some cultural tradition. First of all, I disagree that that's true. And secondly, I think it's insulting. I think it's really, really insulting. But the next thing is, no, I don't accept that premise. Accepting that, to what end? The kid knows they're putting one over on you. It's important to acknowledge the differences in students' lives, cultures, and prior classroom experiences. Why? If I'm going to present the class expectations to everybody equally and say, these are the class expectations. If you have any questions about this or you need any extra help with this, come see me. Or, if it's a little kid, I'll observe them. And if I notice they're having some challenges, I might take them off to the side. I might privately deal with it. I might talk to the parents, might talk to the counselor privately. But I don't adjust, we talk about not one size fits all. That seems to be what they want. Adjust all your expectations down to the, to all of this. Not everyone can do this. So adjust your expectations. But my expectations actually do work. As a general rule, there's nothing wrong with my expectations. The fact that not every kid is ready to meet them is a separate problem. We don't change the expectations. We change how we treat the individual student. But notice there's a lack of focus on individual students here. Okay. So, and then we got to the part about how white students may require differentiated social emotional supports. So there's that. And just moving along from allowing bias, we talked about that. Here we go. Bias can lead even the most well-intentioned and mission-driven adults in schools to disproportionately view students of color as missing social emotional competence. No, that's not bias. I'm sorry, they're accusing countless thousands of teachers of being racists. That's what that means. That's what that be. And if you ask, where are you getting this? They'll say, well, the outcomes. Look at this, the suspension rate. Look at the disciplinary rate. Why do you assume that's bias on the part of the teacher? Why do you assume that? Could it be, I'm just spitballing here, but could it possibly be that there are a greater number of instances where the students demonstrate lack of social emotional competence? Could it possibly be that the higher likelihood, as they're telling us, be mindful of the context, right? The higher likelihood that the misbehaving student is coming from a single parent household where mom is working all the time, and it's usually a mom. I've looked at the stats at the Department of Education. Okay. So I know I'm speaking from a position of quantitative knowledge here, that the statistics are, there's a higher likelihood that they don't have a strong male role model, for example, or that mom's busy and they don't have a strong adult role model in the home as often as maybe some other kids, that they, don't get a lot of sleep, that they, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that you tell me I should take into account. Now you want me to forget that they actually do impact someone's behavior. So take context into account and then ignore it. Take it into account, but don't talk about it. Take it into account, but don't adjust your behavior accordingly. And in the sense that I look at the kid's behavior and I'm compassionate, but I have the same expectations. I don't judge them as a bad person, but I have the same expectations. They would acknowledge that this kid is, comes from these things, but don't act like this is a negative, that it manifests in these behaviors. No, that's a problem. That's you. That's your bias. But my bias is based on reality. Nope. Stop. Nope. Don't let reality get in the way of our agenda. This occurs in school discipline practices where students of color are disproportionately punished. I told you they were going by outcomes for the same behaviors that white students exhibit. Again, could it be that they are disproportionately punished because they disproportionately misbehave? That's not a value judgment. That's an observation. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've talked to other teachers about it. No, teachers are not sitting there going, well, you're white, so it's okay. It's fine. You can cuss me out. That's all right. It's good. Yeah, sit down. That's good. Yeah, we're good here. It's fine. Yeah. I'm reminded of that Eddie Murphy skit from Saturday Night Live where it's like he dresses up in whiteface and like, you don't have to pay. It's cool. It's fine. Teachers are not doing that. So if white students behave some of the same ways, they get punished too. They get disciplined. If they get disciplined less often, it's probably because there are fewer of them doing it. Isn't it possible that fewer of them are doing it because, as I said, they don't meet the other criteria for starting off with more, need for growth? But instead of dealing with these kids as individuals, let's just lump them in a group and say, well, be mindful, change your mindset, expect less. That's what they're saying. Equity here is expect less so we get the same outcome and we have the same number of people punished, which necessarily means reducing the number of people we punish if they're not white. Or conversely, let's look around for things to punish because after all, the white kids are responsible for, dismantling all that racism. So we should just punish them every so often to get them used to that extra responsibility that they have, so they're ready for the rest of their life. So, similarly, English language learners are often seen as academically at risk by virtue of their home language rather than recognizing bilingualism as a critically important benefit to their lives and futures. Can they not be both? Can they not be both? They are potentially at greater risk. Look, I tutor some kids who are bilingual, and they have specific challenges with learning to write in particular. Their grammar and their punctuation and their spelling are more likely, I've seen it in my own practice, they're more likely to have challenges in these areas because they're bilingual. Does that mean I would tell them stop speaking your language at home, or I'm predisposed to be opposed to your bilingual, experience? No. It just means I have to approach them and focus a little harder on their spelling. That's all it means. So it can be both. When I know I'm tutoring a kid who's an English language learner or who is bilingual in a bilingual home, I'm making a mental note going, be on the lookout. Make sure you get all your spelling resources for English language learners handy so you're ready to help the kid, just in case. That's not a bias. That's called being prepared. And again, I thought we were supposed to be teaching in context. That's not a bias. And nobody's judging. So they can be at risk, and bilingualism can be a great thing. Let's see. For example, when a biased teacher does not call in students of color in a classroom, the students are unable to show their belief in their abilities, self-efficacy, the work they've put into learning the materials, self-management, or their skills to socially engage, relationship skills. Are you saying teachers should go out of their way to specifically call in students of color as opposed to just call on the kids who are raising their hands? Okay. Like if a kid raises their hand, if I'm a teacher and a kid wants to answer a question, I can assure you, and I don't know any teacher, literally, I don't know any teachers who are going to, not you. I don't know. I mean, unless the kid is like I was when I was a kid, ooh, ooh, like, Horseshock or whatever the kid's name was in that show, Welcome Back, Kotter. I was a little bit of that after a while. And so sometimes I had the teacher going, anyone but Philman, anyone else? I had that teacher because I was the one doing this. But no, that nowadays, if kids are engaged and raising their hand, I'm pretty sure teachers are not judging by their color and going, yeah, I'm not going to call on you because, you might not know the right answer. What? These experiences may harm students' mindset, again with the mindset, and their beliefs in their ability to achieve goals, which are critical success factors for students. Well, I agree with that. Your belief in your ability to achieve a goal is a critical success factor. So it's probably a bad idea to teach you that the world is against you and that there's this system of racism that your white classmates need to dismantle for you. And because, until they do, you're going to be behind the 8 ball and people need to do special things around you and your context because otherwise, there are barriers to your learning. How does that square with belief in yourself? And then let's see, we got up here. Ensuring students are supported socially and emotionally is not a matter of teaching students to feel differently about the harms they experience in school or how to behave. It's a matter of addressing the implicit and explicit biases of educators and adults who interact with students. In other words, drop your expectations, stop disciplining people, and beat yourself up a little bit if you are white. Make sure you toss some of that shade at your white students too. I'm just translating, guys. That's what I'm reading. I mean, tell me if you read it differently. If my bias is showing, go right ahead. Let's see. This is especially important for social emotional learning because, as discussed previously, social emotional competence is not displayed uniformly across all students. Again, let's sprinkle in statements of fact. Water's wet, so that it sounds very credible. And as you're reading along, you're like, well, that's true. Well, that's true. Adopting restorative justice policies, working towards a positive school climate, systemically enrolling native Spanish speakers in AP Spanish, and utilizing culturally sustaining pedagogy. While culturally sustaining, by the way, is putting the public school, and New York does this explicitly, in the role of sustaining and promoting a culture other than American or, here, like whatever the culture of origin is, they're now saying the school now has a role of sustaining that culture of origin, promoting it and sustaining it. It's anti-assimilation. Now, some people say assimilation is bad or whatever, but the fact of the matter is public school serves one of the purposes is assimilation to a degree, right? Because you have to have a minimum basic standard. It's taxpayer funded where everyone's getting taught the same. This is the law. I mean, this is just how it's supposed to be. Starting to play favorites about whose culture you're going to sustain. Are they sustaining, for example, Jewish culture in the school? Are they sustaining German culture, Irish culture, Scottish culture? Are they sustaining English culture? I don't think so. And they'll say, well, that's white culture. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. And then they'll say Asian, well, which Asian? How many different kinds of Asian culture? That's sort of presumptuous to say that there's Asian culture. It's a continent. Same with Africa, by the way. Black culture. What is black culture? If you have students who've literally come from Africa, from some parts of Africa, what if they come from Tunisia? They're from Africa. Is that, and they may or may not be black. I mean, how granular are you getting with this cultural sustenance? And it's too big a job for a school that is supposed to teach kids to read. And did I mention that they're only accomplishing that about 30% of the time? So when do they have all the time and the staff and the knowledge base? This is saying we need to hire more people, hire more people, hire more people. They'll be union employees too, by the way. Okay. culturally sustaining pedagogy, while steps towards progress are only effective if educators are aware of their biases and are consciously working to reduce these effects on students with professional learning support from their schools and districts. That's another way of saying we're going to constantly check in on you. We're going to constantly check in on you. You are not really a professional who could be trusted to go into the class. It's hilarious to me. These same people will say, we're the experts, not you parents. You shouldn't be able to, teach your own or decide what goes on in the school because we're the experts. But for some reason, they need to be constantly keeping an eye on their experts to make sure their bias doesn't creep in. Which is it? Who are the experts? Can you give me the hierarchy tree of who are like the experts at the tippy top of this little food chain of experts and children? And how far removed from the classroom do you have to be to know all the children perfectly? I'm just curious. Let's see. Consciously working, blah, blah, blah. Limit with professional learning support from the schools. Educators should explicitly state high expectations, unless, of course, it's culturally contraindicated, then don't do that. Build meaningful relationships with students. Oh, okay. And welcome students' cultural values and beliefs into the classroom. All of them? All of them. They're all equally valuable. So let's say, just again, spitballing, that there's a cultural value belief that is explicitly misogynistic, that the child is growing up in a home where they believe that women should sit on the other side of the room. The women should, just not have the same rights as the men. That's how the culture that they come from is, and you can't even believe that there are girls in their class walking around dressed the way they're dressed and speaking openly and so forth and so on. What if they bring that culture into the classroom? What if their cultural values are that homosexuality is a terrible, terrible sin? It's horrible. And they come from a country where people are, hanged or thrown off roofs for it. Is that okay to bring into the classroom? Are there not some universal values that we can champion in public school classrooms in America anymore? Or is it all, it's all relative? Whatever somebody walks in with, that's okay. Unless, of course, they're white. And of course, your whiteness presumes you don't come from any other culture worth noticing. What if you come from, Serbia or Latvia or what if you're Chechen? So you're Muslim, but you're white. What if, there are a million what ifs, but they've classified people as white and said white people have this responsibility. But all these cultures, the cultural values and beliefs. Okay, well, my cultural value and belief is that kids should come to school to learn their academic subjects, and social emotional learning should be strictly to enforce the standards of the classroom that facilitate learning and thriving for children at this developmental level, period. And while not all children are the same, and there is no one size fits all way to treat kids, we can, as educators, individualize our remediation and instruction better than they claim. Much better. You don't dismantle stereotypes by stereotyping. You don't end racism by being racist. You don't achieve equity of outcome by forcing it. You don't achieve it, period. But you're certainly not going to have a prayer of achieving it this way. All you do is entrench tribalism, bad behavior, and things that are, going to get in the way of kids learning because and teachers teaching. It is a rare person who considers themselves a professional who is going to be comfortable for very long in an environment where they are constantly scrutinized like this. With the amount of responsibility your average teacher has these days. So I'm not just responsible to make sure the kids learn the material. I'm not just responsible to make sure they don't beat each other up and kill each other in the class, like that they keep order in the class. I'm not just responsible for all the record keeping that I now have to do, and it's a mountain of record keeping. I have to also manage the emotions of these kids while simultaneously not using any bias, not using any heuristics at all, not holding them to any standard, like a specific standard of behavior, because I have to, it's all in context. A context I can't possibly know unless I spend a lot of time prying into their individual lives and psyches and asking them questions about home and all kinds of other private stuff, which is really none of my business. And quite frankly, I don't want to talk about. I'd rather just talk to them about their reading or their writing or their grammar or their history or whatever the subject is, and do my level best to get to know them here, like as a student. That's it. Anything else is creepy grooming, is me getting too emotionally invested in my students. And the students don't like it. The presumption here is students love all this. No, they don't. No, they don't. So anyway, let's stop this share. That's all I've got from the report. It's a lot longer. I mean, obviously, you guys, this goes on and on and on and on and on. And I definitely recommend that you take a look at it. But I wanted you to see, the high points and to understand that this is a thing. The last thing I'm going to say to you is that SEL, as I said before, is being used as a vessel for critical theory, whether it's critical race theory, critical gender theory, all the critical theories. What is critical theory? Well, critical theory is basically, let's take all of tradition and turn it upside down. Let's take reality and turn it upside down. And the purpose of that, as James Lindsay talks about in an extremely important set of 3 podcasts on new discourses, which I highly recommend, and in fact almost insist that you go listen to, is he talks about how this is how Marxists destabilize the society. We have to separate these kids from their parents, separate them from all the standards and traditions, and more how Mao did, basically, of the olds. Separate these kids from the things that would ground them and actually contribute to their thriving and the perpetuation of our civilization, because then the revolution can happen in the West. That's what it's about. That's what he argues it's about. And he brings the receipts. So I recommend, it's called Groomer School 1, 2, and 3, New Discourses. And when you listen to those podcasts and then you think about these documents and what SEL through an equity lens, it will become clear. It will all click. You should know also that the Republicans, if we're talking about politics, are not your friends in fixing this. I've been made aware recently of some things going on in North Carolina with our Department of Public Instruction, and it's headed by a Republican, and there are other Republicans and lobbyists and so forth who are behind the companies, the private companies that make bank doing the surveys that feed this garbage. And a lot of them are supported by, and this effort is supported by, Republicans. Even Glenn Youngkin is supporting SEL in Virginia schools, as if it's so separate from CRT. No, it is not. No, it is not. It's the same critical theory nonsense, just packaged in this soft, fluffy thing about emotions and social and learning and growth and stuff. But we just read this report. So, yeah, Paulo Freire. That's exactly where that comes from. Let's see what else. I'm just going to quickly go through there. Yeah. So Ego Brain says, I recommend reading Citation 13. It's a joke. This is their evidence, self-reporting and comparing to regions. You will find when you scour these reports, not just this one, but other reports, you will find that their evidence is very often self-reporting, the schools reporting on themselves, or these very same people just going out and getting anecdotes and then reporting on it. It's not quantitative. It's not high quality data. And there's a lot of money in this. Most of the companies that sell the surveys that, gather this data, the information to tell the teacher, like, your kid is feeling sad. Oh, and this is happening. And they come from this household and all of that. They claim it's so necessary. We have to know the ins and outs of what's going on in the kids', inner life. So we're going to survey them, but it's being data mined. That information is not just being held by the government, and that's bad enough, but it's going to private companies to do who knows what with. This is also the beginning, I believe, of the social credit system in the United States that they're going to use the schools. And in fact, there's evidence for that too. You should follow EdTrust and see Sloan Rackman's channel to learn more about that. How the companies that do a lot of this data mining are also the companies that built China's system. But they know they can't come in at the top for us because we'll be like, what? We don't want a social credit system. So what do? Certain kind of passport and this SEL in schools. They'll have everybody's social security number in no time, at least the majorities. So I thank you all so much for coming to this live broadcast. And I apologize. I didn't get through many of these comments, but I think mostly you guys were just kind of playing along. Thank you. And please do share this with others who would be interested. If you aren't already subscribed, please subscribe. Check your subscription if you are or thought you were, because I've noticed some have been dropped off. And consider joining the locals, the reason we learn.locals.com. And as I said, I am a private tutor. So if you have a student who needs help with writing or reading or, writing essays for college, just let me know. Send me a private message. You can through my website at debfilman.com. There's a contact page there and you can reach me that way, or you can find me on, any of the means below, Twitter, etc. So thanks you guys for coming. Have a great afternoon and happy New Year. I'll probably be back before the actual New Year, but if you don't see me and I don't see you, happy New Year.